Well, Dr. Thomas Seager, thank you so much for coming on again. I really appreciate your time in advance.
This is a pleasure for me.
Oh, well, pleasure's all ours. You came on last time. We had a wonderful episode, and we spoke about a lot of topics, and all of which we probably could have had individual episodes on. But one topic we didn't cover, which I think is worth its own conversation, is cancer, and specifically around cancer and coal. I think to probably frame this conversation, it'd be great if we could start with Nixon's war on cancer and the implications of that, and just to probably frame the conversation.
I was very young when President Richard Nixon of the United States created the National Cancer Institute. And if you think about your history from the early 1970s, the war metaphor in the United States was politically very powerful because after World War II, the United States had this global political hegemony. There was no other superpower for a few decades. It wasn't until the rise of the Soviet Union and their nuclear program and that sort of the Cold War reaching its height in which Americans began to feel insecure in their position in the world. As far as America was concerned, we were the victors who could do anything. And so we stepped right into the Korean War without calling it a war. You know, it was a conflict and essentially ended in a stalemate. And there was a hunger for this war metaphor among the Americans who wanted to believe that we were omnipotent. There was Lyndon Johnson's war on poverty. And I'm so sick of the war metaphors, but they reached their zenith when President Nixon declared the war on cancer. He signed a bill that authorized the formation of the National Cancer Institute as if he could mobilize the kind of resources that went into the Manhattan Project or that went into the space program and defeat cancer. The medical doctors and the scientists at the time were saying, oh, yeah, we're really close. We just need a few $1 billion, to push us over the edge. And if I recall correctly, that was 1971. I was 5 years old. We have not made meaningful progress overall in cancer diagnoses since. It's been my entire lifetime that supposedly we've had this war on cancer and we are losing. The same way that the United States poured its resources into Korea or into Vietnam, or for that matter, into Afghanistan, or any number one of these sort of adventurous foreign conflicts. The war on cancer has been a failure. The life expectancy of your average cancer patient has been extended by the hundreds of billions of dollars of research that have been poured through the National Cancer Institute, a total of about a year. And that's it. There are a few specific types of cancer. Non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is one. My sister had it. Mario Lemieux had it. And there have been a few types where the progress has been very good. But in general, the same tools that were available in 1971, poison your body with chemotherapy, burn your body with radiation, cut your body open to remove the tumor tissue. These are the exact same strategies that are in play today, and they've only gotten marginally better. So maybe the National Cancer Institute is looking in the wrong place. Maybe it's time to rethink the metaphor and the entire strategy of cancer research. And there are some people willing to do it. One of them is Professor Thomas Seyfried, and he wrote a book about cancer as a metabolic disease. According to Seyfried, and I'm quite convinced, cancer originates in the metabolism, in disorders of the mitochondria. Now, the dominant theory of cancer that is pursued through the National Cancer Institute is that cancer originates in the nucleus, where the DNA resides. and that there are mutations that take place over time in the nucleus that are never repaired, that result in these aberrant cancer cells that proliferate throughout the body. And it doesn't make any sense. If that were the origin of cancer, then an enormous creature like the bowhead whale, which lives up to 200 years old, the bowhead whale would be riddled with cancer. They have so many cells in which these mutations can originate. They live so long that cancer mutations, if that were really the source of cancer, would be inevitable. The bowhead whale wouldn't make it past 70 years old. This is there's a name for this paradox.
Is it Pitos
And it's
paradox?
not a paradox. What is it called?
Pitos?
Pitos paradox. How could the large creature like the bowhead whale live so long if cancer originates in these random mutations in the DNA in the nucleus? And rather than confront Pitos paradox and say, maybe the paradox is that the theory is wrong, people extend this nucleic DNA theory way past its usefulness. Siegfried says it does not originate in defects of nucleic DNA. It originates in defects of mitochondrial DNA. It is the mitochondria. These are organelles inside the cell, and they're responsible for converting food energy, which is digested into glucose or lipids. So these are either fats or sugars that course through your blood, and they fuel the mitochondria. They convert the food energy into ATP. And ATP is the form of energy that the muscles and the cells, wound repair, growth of your hair, growth of your fingernails, growth of your bones, everything. At the risk of some exaggeration, everything in your body is fueled by ATP. There are some metabolic exceptions. Cancer cells are not. For the most part, cancer cells bypass the mitochondria to continue to metabolize. There are alternative metabolic pathways, and 80% of cancer cells have a gene that is upregulated for glucose fermentation inside the cell instead of the ordinary mitochondrial process of producing ATP. So Siegfried gets really curious about this because mitochondria have their own DNA. This is not something that my high school biology teacher taught me, in ninth grade. We learned about DNA and sexual reproduction, and you get this from your dad, and you get that from your mom, and then, you could have blue eyes, or you could have brown hair, or whatever. Mitochondria have their own DNA, separate from the nucleus, and they are inherited exclusively from your mother. They don't reproduce sexually. They reproduce the same way they've been reproducing for millions and millions of years, because the theory here is that the mitochondria were a separate organism that became subsumed by a more complex single-celled organism, and that instead of eating the mitochondria, they learned to live in this mutualistic symbiosis where certain metabolic functions were being performed by the DNA in the mitochondria, and these sexual reproduction functions and these protein synthesis functions were performed by the DNA in the nucleus. So think of the mitochondria as if they were a separate organism inside your cells on which you rely for energy conversion. And when that separate organism gets messed up, that's where cancer happens. So to test this hypothesis, Siegfried took cancer cells. He removed the mitochondria in the cancer cell. He replaced them with healthy mitochondria transplanted from other cells. And the cells became non-cancerous. The defects in the nucleic DNA were repaired by mechanisms that the mitochondria were fueling. So he says, all right, if healthy mitochondria can repair defective DNA in the nucleus, then why are we blaming the defects in the nucleus for cancer? It's a very clever experiment. And then he went a little further. He said, what would happen if we administered exogenous ketones? That is, if we either fed the ketones to the mice or we injected them with the ketones. Ketones are part of fat metabolism rather than glucose metabolism. Glucose metabolism is very stressful to mitochondria. It creates reactive oxygen species at the site of the energy conversion, and those reactive oxygen species can damage mitochondrial DNA. Ordinarily, it's not a big deal. Reactive oxygen species will also signal what's called mitobiogenesis. Oh, we need new mitochondria. These have been damaged. But if you never give the mitochondria a break from the glucose metabolism, you never have the time for mitobiogenesis. You never give them a chance to become restored. It's just like your muscles. Exercise is great for your muscles, and then you feel sore. If you keep exercising and keep exercising, you can drive yourself quite literally to death because you need recovery as well as you need stress. Your mitochondria work in the same way. They need stress and recovery. Unfortunately, the standard American diet, the diet in Western countries that eat all the ultra processed foods, never get a break. They never get a break from that glucose metabolism. We very rarely go into ketosis. I'm in keto right now. I love going in and out of keto, but I'm the exception to the rule in the United States and in the United Kingdom. Most people spend all of their time in glucose metabolism. So Seifried says, one of the ways that I might be able, without transplanting mitochondria, but to help restore mitochondria, is to administer exogenous ketones. Give the mitochondria a break. And sure enough, the administration of exogenous ketones inhibited the growth of tumors in these animal models. Remember, these lab rats, they are bred to die of cancer. Their whole existence is these cancer experiments so that tumors are generated or either implanted inside the animals so that they will die. And when Seifried administered exogenous ketones, it inhibited the growth of those tumors and it extended the life. So now we have it in our head that cancer originates in the mitochondria and that mitochondrial therapies will improve cancer outcomes. How can we test this hypothesis? Well, we have to think about what are the right mitochondrial therapies to test. And the number one, the best route to mitochondrial health is cold exposure, because cold will fire up your mitochondria for non-shivering thermogenesis. When you have brown fat and you become cold trained or acclimated to the cold, you will recruit to your body brown fat, which are rich in mitochondria. The only way to create that mitochondria is a process called mitobiogenesis. A similar thing can happen when you are shivering inside your muscles, but brown fat is the big difference maker here. A team in Sweden published a paper. This is probably the most definitive work on cold exposure and cancer yet. And this might have come out in 2022. It's fairly recent. Seager et al. They said, okay, we're going to take these animals to whom we have implanted tumors, and we're going to have a control group that stays warm, and we're going to have another group to whom we will subject cryotherapy, 4 degrees centigrade. We're going to house them in cold air for several hours a day. This activates their brown fat. And what they discovered is that the brown fat will preferentially uptake glucose from the bloodstream. Brown fat got the glucose first, and the tumor cells starved because they prefer glucose metabolism to metabolizing fats or ketones. The use of cold exposure in these animal models reduced the rate at which the tumors would grow and extended the life of the animals that otherwise would die from cancer. That's a pretty convincing sort of outcome, that the mitochondria and the metabolism are the correct route through which we should explore cancer therapies, and not the nucleus and not chemotherapy. Well, the Seager team, they didn't stop there. They said, well, that's great. Can we replicate these results in a human being? And so they took a patient who had been through several rounds of chemo, but the chemo had not yet eradicated the tumor cells. This is a human subject. And they did the same thing. They said, there's brown fat cells in this subject and there are cancer cells. Both the brown fat and the cancer are competing for glucose when the subject is cold. And then they used PET, positron emission tomography, to watch in this competition between for glucose between the brown fat and the cancer cells, who's going to win? The brown fat. They showed that the glucose was preferentially uptake to the brown fat, and the cancer cells were starved of the glucose they need to proliferate. It's an incredible finding to me. And yet the National Institute for Health in the United States and the National Cancer Institute don't seem to be interested at all. Because how much money can a pharmaceutical company make by selling you cold exposure and curing you? And the answer is none. They would much rather have you on a lifetime of pharmaceuticals. A patient for life is much more lucrative than a patient for 6 to 10 weeks. There's been some research on ketones as an adjunctive therapy. Like, you're going to do the chemo and you're going to do the radiation, you're going to do the surgery, whatever it is your oncologist prescribes, and you do keto in addition. And sure enough, keto will speed recovery from chemotherapy. Keto will improve the outcomes from these sort of more traditional, from the NCI sort of endorsed therapies. So right now, the medical community is only considering ketosis, a ketogenic diet, or exogenous administration of ketones as this additional or this secondary therapy. There's really no adverse side effects. Compliance in a hospital setting is very difficult because they're trying to feed you all the carbohydrates that they can put on your plate in a hospital. So that's a complication. But if you can comply, you can expect better outcomes from these other treatments. That's wonderful. But I'm going to bring it back to the bowhead whale. There's one more surprising mechanism, which is not metabolic. This is coming out of the University of Rochester. They said, well, there's something about the cold that improves cancer outcomes. They said, and then there's this Peto's paradox with the bowhead whale. Where does the bowhead whale live? The Arctic Ocean. And the water in the Arctic Ocean is cold. And they said, could it be that the cold water in which the bowhead lives somehow supports its immune system or some mechanism that inhibits cancer? Could that be the resolution of Peto's paradox? Or paradox? And they tested this in the lab. And they discovered that cold shock proteins will repair cancerous defects in nucleic DNA. It's not just that the mitochondria provide the energy for repair of the DNA. The cold itself will create the proteins that are the mechanism of DNA repair. So now we have three promising hypotheses to explore with regard to cold exposure and cancer. The first is glucose starvation of tumor cells by activating brown fat. The second is the inhibitory effect that ketones in the bloodstream can have on cancer and the growth of tumors. And that's exogenous ketones in Seyfried's experiment, but cold exposure, ice baths are the fastest way to produce your own endogenous ketones. So it's a good fit. And then the third is these cold shock proteins that will repair the nucleic DNA defects. If that is the case, Ben, if we sort of think that these are promising hypotheses, then wouldn't it make sense if we could find somewhere, somehow, some person who has healed themselves from cancer? Like, if these hypotheses had any merit, then shouldn't there be someone among the billions of people on this planet who said, yes, I did cold water and I cured myself of cancer? And the fact is, there are. And they have been writing to me and saying, either I've shrunk my tumor, or I was stage 4 and now I'm completely cancer-free. Or in the case of Dean Hall, I had leukemia when I went into the Willamette River. And 3 weeks later, after I'd swum the entire length of that thing and gone in and out of hypothermia, and I came out of the river, I didn't have leukemia anymore. So there are these extraordinary case studies of people who have used cold water because the medical establishment had nothing left to offer them. Said, you're inoperable, you are untreatable, you are going to die, go home and get your affairs in order. And what they did instead was ice bath. And they got better outcomes. There are people walking this earth who should be dead by now. They're not, because they tell me they did cold plunge. So why is the National Cancer Institute still trying to refine chemotherapy instead of starting some new initiative saying, we should put Morozko in every cancer ward in the country and see whether this is going to improve the life expectancy and the quality of life of cancer patients. And I could speculate with new hypotheses that it's either too crazy or it won't make the right people enough money.
That is a wonderful answer, and there's so many different things I want to pull on different threads. I think to get the lay of the land, currently in America, and correct me if I'm wrong, there's not the equivalent or a war of on cancer, but shifting away from the, I guess, broken DNA theory, I'm not even sure what it's called, to the metabolic theory. There's nothing to my knowledge of the same sort of magnitude. Is that correct?
Seager remains in the minority, sort of on the edges of the cancer research community. And I should really call him up, and I should ask him more about his book and his work and what sort of reception he gets within the established funding institutions like the National Institute of Health and the National Cancer Institute.
But it wasn't a recent book, to my surprise. Right, it's been around for a while, if I'm correct, and the fact that this hasn't been taken up is astonishing. I want to just jump in back to keto, because I think that gives a helpful framework for people to sort of get on the same page. A lot of work during the keto has been in ketosis has been studied around cancer. I mean, Dom D'Agostino has done some wonderful work, and essentially my understanding is it's that the two sort of proposed mechanisms for it. It's the starvation of the cancer cell by reducing all glucose, similar to what you were telling me the brown fat does. So my first question just there is, what would be more effective at reducing glucose in the bloodstream and in turn reducing the amount of fuel a cancerous cell could have? Ketosis and or cold exposure?
I don't think there's any need to separate them. You don't have to choose one or the other. It's a false dichotomy. The ketones now you can buy, ketone drinks. Some people say they taste like jet fuel, but I don't know. I've never tasted jet fuel because the ketogenic diet is difficult for people in Western countries to comply with. This exogenous administration, putting ketones into your diet by drinking them, is a way to get them into your bloodstream. And according to Seager's study, if Seager's studies have any legitimacy in human beings, there will be a benefit. It would be wrong to say it's a cure, but there will be a benefit in the inhibition of cancer cell proliferation. However, you don't have to be on a ketogenic diet to produce your own ketones. You can get into the ice bath and you know that you will get an immediate blood sugar spike. This is coming from the sympathetic division of your central nervous system. That's that fight or flight. As long as you're cold enough in the water to gasp and you feel scared, then your body is like, you're going to die. Your liver will release glucagon, which is a glucose polymer. It goes into your bloodstream. It breaks into glucose right away. You get this immediate glucose spike, and that is to fuel your muscles and your brown fat to protect you against, your imminent death, or at least it feels that way. And your brown fat and if you're shivering, your muscles will take that glucose, clear it right out of your bloodstream almost immediately. And because lipid metabolism is a little slower, your white fat cells will also release fat into your bloodstream to take over when the glucose is gone. As a result of that fat metabolism, this really only takes a minute, you will begin to produce ketones as well, regardless of your diet, regardless of sort of the metabolic state before you got into the ice bath. Now, when you get out, those ketones will be consumed, and depending upon what you eat, you might fall out of ketosis. You might never even reach ketosis in the sense that when you pee on a stick, you pop the test and it shows that you have sort of small or moderate ketones in your urine. But your body will respond to cold plunge therapy by making its own ketones. It is a way, instead of sort of feeling like you're starving yourself for 3 days, it's a way to put yourself into ketosis a lot faster. You might have an appetite and have the eggs instead of the Pop-Tarts after your ice bath. You don't have to choose between cold exposure and ketones. They come together.
I think your answer really helps me understand it mechanistically, and I've read similar mechanisms where you can take a exogenous ketone supplement like a ketone salt or an ester, or I think it's called beta hydroxybutyrate, and you will put your body in a fast form of ketosis, right? You could not be in ketosis, have whatever you want for breakfast, carbs, have a exogenous ketone supplement, and your blood concentration of ketones will be saying you're in ketosis. If I understand you correctly, getting into an ice bath will create demand for immediate glucose, so helping you deplete the glucose out of your muscle cells, and then followed by your white fat releasing ketones into the bloodstream, creating a similar state of what the exogenous ketone does. But then I guess if you do it more longer term, you get the brown fat activation as well, which would then help suck more glucose on a more continuous basis. Have I got that right?
You're not wrong, Ben, but it's a little sloppy. The white fat cells, they don't release ketones, they release lipids. So they will release fat molecules. The ketones are produced as an intermediary metabolic product. They are a consequence of fat metabolism. When you take exogenous ketones, you're sort of stepping into the middle of fat metabolism. Your body makes its own ketones. But you can also take them exogenously, and your body is capable of digesting them. But ketones don't exist. There's no ketone fruit, or there's no animal that you would. I'm fishing for the ketone fish or something. Those ketones, those exogenous ketones that you're drinking, they are produced by chemical engineering processes. They don't exist as part of, a balanced diet or something like that, because your body will make its own ketones as part of fat metabolism. It's a little less efficient. That is, these additional steps for fat metabolism are somewhat more expensive, but it's a good thing that fat is very rich in energy. Your body, when it's in fat metabolism, for the most part, can afford those additional metabolic steps. Whereas glucose, you eat, the breakfast cereal, and it's going to go straight into your bloodstream as glucose. It's extremely efficient. It will spike your insulin. And then what does that insulin do? It increases the size of your white fat cells. It says, we got to clear this glucose out of the bloodstream. We're going to store it as fat in these white fat cells for leaner times, for the winter. You're in the United Kingdom and blueberries don't grow in London in the winter. There are no carbohydrates to speak of in that sort of the diet around the North Sea. But there's fat and there's fish. There might be root vegetables, I suppose. So there could be some carbs, and that's okay. There's no obligatory level of carbohydrate that you must have in your diet. Your liver will synthesize the glucose that your body really needs from protein. So a ketogenic diet is not a high protein diet. It's not even a low carb diet. These can be true, but the best way to get into ketosis through diet alone is a high fat diet, because ketones are an intermediary metabolic product of fat metabolism. When it comes to the brown fat will be activated immediately. If you've got brown fat in your body, it will be activated through the nervous system. This is very fast. Temperature receptors in your skin, they signal the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus signals the brown fat, and it does it through the nervous system. Get going. It will begin with glucose because that's the fastest fuel available, but it will also start the lipid metabolism or fat metabolism process to generate the heat you need to stay warm. And so I'm trying to be a little bit more precise in what happens, what are the mechanisms and in what order do they take place. You can increase your blood level of ketones by taking a ketone ester drink. And I think that you can get some benefits from that if you're trying to recover from chemo, if you're working on tumor inhibition. It's an additional energy source that your muscles can use. I've tried it and I don't mind the taste, but Thanksgiving is a big sort of holiday in the United States. And part of the tradition at Thanksgiving is pie. Pumpkin pie is my favorite. And so last Thanksgiving, I ate a whole it was a half a pie, because you have a slice, like, oh, that's delicious. And you have when you have Thanksgiving dinner, everything is portioned out. But the day after Thanksgiving, you go in the fridge, and Thanksgiving leftovers in America are like one of the greatest delights. And I just ate all the leftover pie. And then I thought, uh-oh, what have I done? I experienced sort of food regret. I overdid it. I went straight into my ice bath. And I was wise enough to measure the ketone levels in my urine before and after the ice bath. And despite all the carbohydrates that I ate in that pie, the ketone levels in my urine went up 4 hours after my ice bath because I'd cleared that glucose out, because I'd kept myself in fat metabolism despite my diet by activating my brown fat.
That, I think, is really powerful to help understand the mechanism, because I think once you understand the mechanism, you realize, okay, fine. So through cold exposure, there's a higher concentration of ketones in my blood. And if I had a cancerous tumor, that is not going to work. It's not going to end well for the tumor in the sense of it's going to harm the tumor. The actual direct application of the ketones doesn't seem to be favorable for the tumor at all. Although not conducive and not cure, as you said. But was it Seki et al. Who showed that? Am I right? Okay, interesting.
There are different types of tumors. I don't know. We can classify them, but from what I read in Seafried, 80% of these cancer cells that he assayed have a gene that's upregulated for glucose metabolism. There are some types of cancers that can also metabolize ketones, and so we'll have this podcast and we'll publish it, and someone will say, that's so wrong. He's not a doctor. He doesn't know. Ketosis is not a cure for cancer. Okay. Neither is chemotherapy. A cure for cancer is not the standard that we're trying to meet. What we're trying to do is discover an array of tools that will improve outcomes in cancer patients. Chemo is no guarantee. Radiation's no guarantee. Surgery is no guarantee. We're trying to improve outcomes. And if ketones, which have no side effects, we're not worried about ketosis in our patients. If they improve recovery from chemotherapy, if they inhibit most types of cancer cells, then why aren't we trying those too? And the answer is because they don't make anybody in power enough money. It's the only answer I can come up with.
Perverse incentives.
Give it a try. What do you have
terrible.
to lose?
Yeah.
Yep.
The I read the other day in prep for this Dom because to try and understand more mechanistically about ketosis, Dom D'Agostino seems to be the go-to place, and he said that for more glycolytic tumors, the ketones and added ketosis works better. And he said actually testicular cancer is one that doesn't show that this mechanism would be that helpful for, but apparently things like colon cancer and bowel cancer and things in the sort of gastrointestinal area work pretty well. I want to touch on chemotherapy because there's some research around when you combine chemo with fasting a few days before and or ketosis a few days before, you have a better outcome. In your opinion, does cold therapy have a place in that specific period if someone did have cancer?
According to the people who have written to me and done chemo and combined it with ice baths, they get better recovery, faster recovery from chemo, which is an intentional poisoning of your body. They snap back faster. There's one, I'm trying to remember his name, Adam, he's on Instagram, Adam Iceman or Adam Breathwork. He told me a story of how he went through chemo. He discovered ice baths. He recovered more quickly from the chemo, and he still needed surgery. And he said, all right, how am I going to do this? They said, you won't be strong enough to undergo surgery for at least 8 weeks because you've been through these multiple rounds of chemo. He said, all right, how am I going to prepare for my surgery? And he kept up with his daily cold plunge practice. When he walked in 8 weeks later, and they said, all right, we've got to measure this, we've got to examine this, we have to make sure that you can withstand the surgery. They said, you're amazing. Like, you're in great shape. We've never seen somebody bounce back from the chemo this fast. They did the surgery. He was entirely successful. He's now in remission. He's very healthy. You can look at his Instagram. He will talk about his experience. So not only did he use ice baths in conjunction with chemo, he used ice baths to better prepare his body for the surgery. So how might that work? Well, chemo is an intentional stressor. You poison the body, you're damaging the body. And then, of course, you need recovery between your rounds of chemo, in which the healthy parts of the body, you hope, are coming back faster than the unhealthy parts. That recovery is fueled by mitochondria. The stronger your mitochondria, the faster your recovery, because the recovery requires energy. It is possible that what he was doing with ice baths was supporting his, not just his immune system, which is also a mechanism of recovery, but his mitochondria, so that his body had the energy it needed to rebuild the tissues and recover from the intentional trauma that was meant to be an essential part of his healing.
So you have people write to you all over the world about this, and Dean Hall's story is wonderful, and there's mechanisms to back all this up. God forbid, in a hypothetical world, you personally were to get some form of cancer. What would you implement in your whole? How would you approach it? What would be your strategy?
I'm gonna tell you a story about AJK. She's on Twitter, and she's in my book. We'd been dating for a few years. This is all before COVID. And I got a call while I was in Texas. I was visiting my daughter, and she said, I'm in acute abdominal pain. It feels like maybe I popped an ovarian cyst, but it feels worse than that. I've felt that pain before. I've birthed 5 children, and this pain is worse, but maybe it will pass. And I said, pass? Are you kidding? Get yourself to the hospital. Like, let's, before COVID, I still had some modicum of trust in the institutions of medicine. She did, and I flew back to Phoenix. I went to visit her. What is going on? They won't tell me. She says they've drawn blood and they're doing scans, and she didn't even want her girls to come visit her because she was scared and she didn't want them to see her scared. Well, they weren't telling her anything because her case had to go all the way up to the tumor board at the hospital. She had a growth on her liver, and I forget exactly how big it was, but several centimeters. She had a history of a bleeding disorder, which meant that they could not operate on this growth. The liver is nothing but blood vessels. And if her bleeding disorder coincided with surgery to remove this growth, she would just die right there on the operating table. It wasn't a candidate for chemotherapy, and it wasn't a candidate for radiation. They could offer her nothing. And so when they finally explained why she was experiencing this pain, it was because the growth on her liver was causing the liver to bleed out internally, and the blood was leaking out of the liver into the rest of her body. The pain could be inflammation, or it could be any number of things. But it's why she was having an acute event. And so she asked her doctor, what did the tumor board say? Watchful waiting. What the hell is watchful waiting, Ben? When you have this spontaneous growth come out of nowhere on your liver and send you to the hospital, what the hell is watchful waiting? It feels like a death sentence. And she said, Tom, what am I going to do? I said, you're going to do what Dean Hall did. You're going to go keto. You're going to get in the ice bath. You're not going to leave your children motherless without a fight. So she did. She took all the concentrated carbohydrates out of her diet. She got serious about getting into the ice bath. And it was 5 or 6 months later, she had her, part of watchful waiting is to do these follow-up scans. Damned if she hadn't shrunk that tumor. And what do spontaneous liver tumors do, Ben? They don't shrink. She changed the conditions that were conducive to the growth of the tumor. And those conditions were a high carbohydrate diet. And she knew it because several years, 2 years earlier, she had been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, despite the fact that she was lean, despite the fact that when she measured her body fat, she was at 12%. She was lean because she was anorexic. And so you'd wonder, how could type 2 diabetes exist in someone so thin? Because it's ordinarily associated with obesity. And the fact is, she was living on a diet of Coca-Cola and aspirin. She was so high in her carbohydrate mix that even at 800 calories a day, she had damaged her mitochondria. When she changed her diet and she started doing a little more meat, a little more fat, little experimenting with ketosis, she healed herself of the type 2 diabetes, but it took the ice bath to inhibit this tumor growth. Type 2 diabetes, or more broadly, insulin resistance, is one of the most important risk factors for any type of cancer, which suggests that cancer originates in defects or disorders of the metabolism. It originates in mitochondrial damage. And so the evidence here, the case for looking at the mitochondria rather than the nucleus, is becoming more and more important. You're asking, what would I do if I had a cancer diagnosis? And I can only tell you about what my girlfriend did, what I advised her to do, because I've never had a cancer diagnosis. My father, he had 5 different types of cancer, but he thought they were all his doctor's problem. I don't ever want to be in that position. My health is my problem. And the closest I ever got to a cancer diagnosis was this elevated PSA test that I had. So it's prostate specific antigen. And it's not cancer. It's associated with increased risk of cancer, but all it means is you have an inflamed prostate. But this happened to me at a time, Ben, when I didn't know anything. I just got my routine sort of male blood panel. PSA comes back 7. And so I go online. Oh, what does that mean? And if you go to WebMD or the Cleveland Clinic or the Mayo Clinic and all the sites that you think have responsible health information, and you have a PSA of 7, you will come away from the internet thinking you are going to die of prostate cancer. So I got really scared. And they all said you should go to a urologist, have a prostate exam, have a biopsy as a precautionary measure. But when I talked to guys about what their experiences were, it sounded terrible. The biopsy is not benign. There's a risk of infection. There's case studies of people who have died from the biopsy because they have a sepsis infection that could not be successfully treated in a hospital environment. And there's too many false positives that come out of the biopsy. So all these fears are running around in my head. And I said, I'm going to take a different approach. I'm going to use keto and ice baths. And that's when I started getting into the ice bath every single day, because I was scared out of my mind and I was determined to do anything I could to avoid the allopathic route to a prostatectomy. It's the best answer I can give you about what would I do with my own body or the people that I love. You never really know until you are confronted with it yourself. And I can't judge people who are making their own decisions. Fear is a massive motivator. There are very few men who have followed my article and said, I'm going to treat my elevated PSA, my prostate inflammation, with ice baths rather than a biopsy and surgery. I'd applaud them if they have the courage to do that. But everyone in their world is probably telling them the opposite. Their wives, their children. No, Dad, please do this for us. We care about you. We don't want to lose you. Fear is an incredible motivator. And the the allopathic institutions of medicine, what Jack Kruse would call centralized medicine, is expert at generating fear in patients to motivate those patients to do what these centralized medical institutions want you to do.
When you understand the mechanism, though, I think you help people get there. And that's why I think conversations like this are really, really important and vital, because you give people the top of the rabbit hole, and they can go on PubMed and type in Seager et al. 2022. They can read your articles, which you've synthesized a lot of research really, really well with links to the articles. And I would implore people to check out Thomas's Substack. And it's a wonderful resource if you want a slightly deeper dive and sort of take your time over some of the articles. The reason why I ask, what would you do? I mean, obviously, no one wants that and everything. It's just your unique lens into this shift of the metabolic theory of cancer and how actually cold can be a really great intervention. And it seems keto in cold therapy would be a no-brainer as a first port of call. Where do you see the literature going? I mean, have you reached out to Seager et al., whoever the person is? Have you reached out to the metabolic theory? Or what's their opinion? Where does this go next?
What a great question. I should write to them and I should ask them that question. What are you going to do with these spectacular results? What are you going to do with these amazing revelations? And what's really interesting is that they're coming out of Sweden. All of the best work on cold exposure as medicine is happening in countries that were not part of NATO during the Cold War. So we're talking about countries that were either behind the Iron Curtain, Poland, the Czech Republic, or countries that were on the border in ways that were not part of the NATO alliance, Finland, Sweden. So it's these Eastern European countries. And I thought, well, isn't that a crazy coincidence? They don't have cold in the United Kingdom? Of course they have cold. They don't have cold in Norway? Of course they have cold. But what they have in the United Kingdom that does not exist in Poland is GlaxoSmithKline. What they have in the NATO countries is an allegiance to Pfizer or Moderna, or for that matter, Novo Nordisk. The biggest pharmaceutical manufacturers are all in countries that operate with a government monopoly on the Western side of the Iron Curtain. And so I looked up the NIH funding. How much NIH funding goes to Sweden? Practically none. How much goes to a country like Uganda? Tens of millions of dollars a year. Now, do you think, Ben, that Uganda is such a hotbed of leading edge medical expertise that the NIH should be funding this cutting edge research? Because I've talked to Ugandan faculty and they're wonderful people, very caring about their students, working in very difficult circumstances to lift up the state of Ugandan education. And they are not prepared to do the type of research that would compete for NIH funds. So what's going on in Uganda rather than Sweden? And I'm just taking Uganda as an example because I have acquaintances there whom I've run projects with. The countries that are researching cold plunge as therapy are those countries that were, in any case, beyond the reach of the institutions, in particular the government institutions of centralized medicine. Lithuania is a great example. The Marius Brazaitis at the Lithuanian Sports University has done the best work of anybody on cortisol and cold plunge. And he doesn't get a dime from the NIH. He's not sponsored by Glaxo. He doesn't get a grant from Pfizer, or he wouldn't be doing that kind of research. So some people will say, Lithuanian Sports University, that's not Oxford. That's not, King's College. That's not Johns Hopkins. And that's why you can trust it.
It's such an interesting perspective, especially in the UK, where, NHS is brilliant and wonderful, but they're experts in illness, and anything alternative gets their shackles up, and there's almost a worldview clash. And I mean, even this conversation, most people in the UK would if I read them the description of our conversation with a couple of notes, they'd be like, what a load of baloney. And then you hear the mechanism, and then you see, you know, who Sequital is, and among others, and you know, yourself, and slowly they start to listen up. And the sad reality is, I don't think it should take a cancer scare to suddenly start to look at this kind of thing. You know, everyone's been affected by cancer in some way, shape, or form through someone they know. And yeah, I think it's a really important conversation we've had. You know, the important learnings from you, especially today. And you know, if they help one person, wonderful. Have we missed anything on cancer? Anything you wish we would have covered?
I'm so glad we covered a lot of ground. However, when you get a cancer diagnosis, you're going to deal with that. What can you do before the diagnosis? You know, we're not going to just sit around and wait for a cancer diagnosis and then say, oh, okay, I'm going to make these lifestyle changes so I can have better outcomes. There are two incredibly important things. You got to take care of your metabolism. And so we've talked about that. Some carbohydrates themselves are not evil, so to speak, but you have to give your body a rest from the carbohydrates. So that might be intermittent fasting. There are several pathways that will damage your mitochondria. One of them is there's no break from carbohydrates ever. And so your mitochondria never have that recovery time to stimulate the mitobiogenesis. There are two more. You get your light hygiene out of whack. Too much blue light at night, too much of any type of light at night. Your circadian rhythm is messed up. And this will interfere with your melatonin production. Now, mitochondria make their own melatonin. Melatonin is how they protect themselves against reactive oxygen species. The melatonin give up electrons to these reactive oxygen species before the DNA become damaged. And so having your melatonin in the right place by taking care of your light hygiene, very important. The third one is seed oils. People fail to recognize, because they just haven't been told, that fats are an important building block. Fats play a material role inside the body. We're all taught about how many calories fat has, as if fat was only energy. But it is fat that all of your cell membranes are made of. And when you give your body the wrong proportion of fats, then your membranes are made of the wrong type of fat molecules. This interferes with transport of nutrients and energy across those cell membranes. So you can mess up your mitochondria with too many carbs without a break, poor light hygiene, and too many seed oils in your diet. Those are three things that you can do metabolically to reduce your risk of cancer by caring for your mitochondria. Of course, cold plunge therapy is a wonderful thing to do for your metabolism. It's associated with insulin sensitivity. If you're insulin resistant, you can improve your insulin sensitivity. That is, overcome your, you can heal your resistance by using cold plunge therapy. Exercise will do it too. But this is my final thought. It is vitamin D. Vitamin D deficiency is associated with an increased risk of cancer. Why should that be? Vitamin D is essential for the proper function of the immune system. People think we catch cold in the winter because of the cold temperatures, and nothing could be further from the truth. The cold temperatures, not chronic cold exposure, but acute cold exposure, is good for our immune system. But what happens in the winter is less sunshine, less vitamin D, poor immune function that leaves us vulnerable to the viruses that are already circulating. Vitamin D is an immune system boost that will help prevent cancer diagnoses in the first place. So what's the best thing you can do, Ben, is get in your Moroz coat and then get out and get some sunshine, for your rewarming. You're keeping your immune system function good by getting the vitamin D and giving it that cold shock all at once. At least I live in Phoenix and there's a lot of sun, but you'd be amazed how many people are vitamin D deficient because it's 45 degrees Celsius is the forecast high for today. They don't want to be outside in the sun when it's abundant in Phoenix. So they stay inside their air-conditioned cars and their air-conditioned off. They're not getting anywhere near enough sunshine. For me, a day like today, you can see the sun over my shoulder. You can see I've got my Morozko out on my little balcony there. I'm going to be in there again today. I'm going to do 2, and I will go out and I will make the vitamin D. Hopefully, I'll never have a cancer diagnosis.
Oh, he's hoping that. Me too. Me too. And I think, yeah, I mean, a load of studies come to mind. I mean, the surfers in Hawaii who go out surfing, but yet were still deficient in vitamin D3. It's quite an old study, but still fascinating. Actually, on the light as medicine piece, we're having Dr. Glenn Jeffries come on the podcast in about a month, and I want to ask him about that sort of near infrared light melatonin piece, and how we all spend 92% of our time inside or in a car. So yes, to be further unpacked. But Thomas, thank you so much for that. It was an absolute masterclass, and I think a lot of food for thought. And once again, you're the man. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben. This is a wonderful forum in which I get to talk about these things. I'm very happy about it.